So we've had a lot of questions about our street policy, so I thought I'd take a moment to talk about the street policy and what it is, how it works. Right now I'm standing near the intersection of Gordy and 9th, and we're going to show you two different types of streets to kind of hopefully clarify a little bit about what's an improved street and what's an unimproved street. All right, so right behind me we have Gordy Street, and Gordy is what we call an improved street. An improved street by city standards is going to include not only the street, which I'm standing on in the middle here, but it also includes the curb and guttering that is on both sides of the street. The curb and guttering provides the flow channel to get stormwater off of the surface of the street to the side of the street and ultimately off the street as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Some streets will also include underground stormwater, which will be like a catch basin, which will then remove the water from the street and take it in an underground pipe downstream, so to speak. This improved street that I'm standing on, while we think about the street as the top of the street, the surface of the street is actually the very basic part of the street. The main part of the street and the most important part of the street is actually below the surface. So if we go about 2 inches below the surface, or in some cases even deeper than that, we'll get to what we call the base. And the base is going to be a mix of concrete and rock and fly ash, or different components that are mixed together, and then water is added on top of that to make it very hard. And that is really where the structure of the street comes from. The strength and integrity of that street is in the base. Okay, so on the other side of Gordy, we have an unimproved street. Now, as you can see on this street, it's first of all gravel, so we can definitely tell that it's unimproved from that side. But we can also tell that there's no curb and gutter. We have a ditch that runs on one side of the street. So another question we've been getting a lot of is, how does an unimproved street turn into an improved street like the other side of Gordy here? Well, the city's policy is there's two ways. The first way is citizens that live along the street can petition the city to have their street improved. What this means is that those citizens would go around their neighborhood and get folks to sign a petition stating that, number one, they want the city to improve the street, and two, they are willing to pay special assessments or an additional tax to pay for the street. Generally, the city finances streets over a 20-year time horizon, which means that you'll have a special tax for 20 years to pay for that street. The city's policy also says that citizens, property owners, will only pay for 2 streets. So generally, you're going to pay for a street that goes in front of your property and one that goes next to your property, or the next street down. Now, depending on where you live, you might not be paying a special assessment for a street because that street's probably been paid off many years ago, particularly if the street's been around for over 20 years. But if you buy in a newly developed lot or a piece of property, then you're likely going to have a special assessment. Or if you buy a piece of property that has recently petitioned in, or if you petition a street to be developed, then you're going to have a special assessment for about 20 years. The second way that a street can be done is if the city decides to go ahead and improve a street and assess the adjacent property owners for that project. Generally, the city does not force street improvements in. It has historically waited for the neighborhood or those citizens that live along that street to petition this. So I'm going to take a brief moment and talk about the economics of street maintenance to give you guys an idea of what that looks like from a real financial standpoint. So the city has about 87 miles of streets within its corporate limits. And generally speaking, it costs about $350,000 to mill and overlay 1 mile of streets. So that costs about $30 million, a little over $30 million to mill and overlay all the streets within El Dorado. Well, we're not going to do that in 1 year. $30 million is just a super astronomical number. So if we break that out and we say a mill and overlay generally should last about 15 years before we need to mill and overlay the street again, that means we would have to spend about $2 million per year on mill and overlays in order to mill and overlay every street every 15 years. We've also been getting a lot of questions about the city's sales tax. Like, how does the sales tax work for street maintenance? Presently, the city receives $600,000 from its 1 cent sales tax that's allocated specifically for street maintenance. Of that $600,000, $500,000 goes to our annual mill and overlay program. Now, as I just mentioned a moment ago, we need about $2 million every year to make sure that we mill and overlay every street every 15 years. So, if you can do the math, $500,000 in mill and overlay dollars is a lot less than $2 million. So we don't do the amount of streets that we need to do in order to make sure that every street lasts or gets a good mill and overlay every 15 years. So to give you an idea of what that would look like if we were to want to cover that deficit, we would need either 17 to 18 mills of property taxes in addition to what we currently pay, or we would need about 3/4 of a cent additional sales tax just to be able to cover all of the streets every 15 years. So because of this significant street maintenance cost, it's very important that the city provides preventative maintenance to its improved streets to extend their life as much as possible, knowing that we're not going to come back to that street for probably more than 15 years. And that's where we have things like crack sealing, patching, even reclamite and other treatments that we do to our improved streets. From an economic standpoint, it doesn't make sense to do preventative maintenance for unimproved streets because we'd have to constantly come back and constantly put more money into these streets, which is why unimproved streets do not qualify for sales tax dollars. In order to receive sales tax funds, which by the way I didn't mention, but the $600,000 that goes to streets, $100,000 of that goes to preventative maintenance. None of those dollars, however, are allocated to unimproved streets. The reason for that is because all of our preventative maintenance dollars would go to unimproved streets because of the cost it takes to keep these things maintained over keeping our dollars invested in our improved streets. Another question we get is how does the city select streets for its annual mill and overlay program? So the first step is we conduct an inspection, and then the next step is we prioritize the streets based on their condition. Now, it's important to note that we aren't necessarily hitting the worst streets. The reason for that is, in some cases, those streets need additional work, for example, a full depth replacement as opposed to a mill and overlay. So what we try to do is we try to prioritize projects that allow the city to use its mill and overlay dollars in the best manner, and that's really the preservation of that base that's underneath the surface of the street. If the base needs to be replaced, a mill and overlay simply will not work. Again, that needs a full depth replacement of that base. Otherwise, if we just replace the surface, you're going to get cracking, you're going to get spider cracking, you're going to get a whole host of problems in that new surface, and it's actually not, it's going to just be a waste of dollars. So staff tries to determine which streets are going to be best suited for a mill and overlay, prioritizes those, and then generally creates a plan where we do the streets in a geographic area so as to reduce the mobilization costs of our contractor. So it's not really a science, it's more of an art, but we are in fact going to be adding some science to that mix as we do a new pavement conditions assessment in the coming months, and that will give us a grading of each street and allow us to prioritize streets based on a score that is going to allow us to create a more objective multi-year plan for our street maintenance projects. So we've also been getting a lot of questions about 9th Avenue. What are the plans? 9th Avenue is probably the most infamous street in El Dorado right now. It's obviously got some interesting structural problems. 9th Avenue is actually classified as an unimproved street, even though it looks like it's got asphalt on it. This is actually not asphalt, but it's layers and layers and layers of what we call slurry seal. And just added up over time, much like the Grand Canyon, it has now a layer that looks like an improved street surface. And then of course this black top layer, while it looks like brand new asphalt, it's actually just a giant patch the Public Works Department has done. Now you might ask, well, why has the Public Works done a pothole patch or a giant patch on 9th Avenue when it's not an improved street? Well, part of the reason is because, as you may have known, 9th Avenue was very bad condition. We do get a lot of traffic on here. The City Commission has talked about improving the street, but it will cost about $1.5 to $2 million to improve the street, and presently the Commission is not interested in allocating those dollars to this project at this point in time. So we were looking at some short-term options to experiment with to determine if we can actually come up with a solution for some of our unimproved streets. This patch is one of those experiments. So we had Public Works come in and put down this patch to kind of see what it would look like, how it would ride, to determine if this is something that we can maybe do elsewhere in our unimproved areas. The long-term plan for 9th Avenue is still up for discussion. The Commission continues to weigh options, and they continue to also talk about the street policy to determine if changes are warranted with respect to unimproved streets, so that we can figure out where we're going to go with that. In the meantime, we have provided at least a temporary solution to the street, but it is likely going to be the solution, at least for the near future. So I hope that helped everyone understand a little bit more about our street policy and answered maybe some of the questions that are out there. The other thing that I'd like to say really quickly is July 4th is quickly approaching. It's hard to believe, but it's nearly here. So I want to encourage everyone to watch our Facebook page and our website for more information about all the great activities that are going to be happening for July 4th, so that you know what's going on in El Dorado. With that in mind, have a great weekend, and we will see you soon.